Hello, I'm Jo Rose with University of York in the UK. I started my career in the climate change sector, working largely in Mozambique and Tanzania. Then moved into the humanitarian sector, working in South Sudan and Somalia. Then I moved into the evaluation field, conducting evaluations for um, donors such as the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then later I moved into academia. And thank you for joining my session today, which is on climate change and humanitarian aid. Today I'm going to firstly have a look at how the humanitarian sector impacts on the environment and climate change, just at a glance. Then I'm going to draw on some of the negative experience I've seen in the humanitarian field, and then move on to some positive experiences of where I've seen some really good climate-informed and climate-resilient humanitarian aid involving the sectors of WASH, livelihoods, health and well-being. Historically, humanitarian agencies have not had to be accountable for their impact on the environment and the climate, but this is changing and we're seeing increasing pressure is mounting on them to be more accountable, to reduce their carbon footprint and to measure it. The huge challenge that we have though is that they all calculate their impact differently and they also decide what to count. For example, in 2019, WFP produced 663 metric tonnes of waste, but that did not include all of its offices. And they also contributed roughly less than 200,000 metric tonnes of greenhouse gases, but that didn't include procurement efforts and staff commuting. Similarly, in 2019, MSF contributed just under 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, but they only included Amsterdam offices and 30 operational offices. And as we know that MSF are operational in over 70 countries and have 39 international offices, this is actually only accounting for less than half of their emissions. As well as our direct emissions the humanitarian responses have, they also have huge indirects on the environment. For example, between 3,000 to 4,000 acres of forests have been cut down to make way for temporary shelters in Cox's Bazar. And in 2021, WFP bought over $41 million worth of palm oil to be used in countries such as Afghanistan and Togo, where climate change itself is having a massive impact. And we have to remember that palm oil, which largely comes from Malaysia and Indonesia, is an industry driving deforestation at a huge scale, and it often involves child and slave labour operating in very unsafe conditions. Moving forward, business as usual is not an option. Moving forward, we have to understand how climate change impacts on a humanitarian response and how a humanitarian response impacts on the environment and the climate. And we need to do this with a cradle-to-grave approach. So we need to understand what's known as embodied carbon, which is the carbon footprint of every element involved in the process. So from extraction of raw materials and minerals, to productions, to transportation, shipping, flights, to the ultimate disposal of any end products. And we have to also understand the indirect impacts of our decisions before we implement them. Through the rest of the presentation, I want you to keep two things in mind. One, the financial costs, and the costs at every stage of implementing a humanitarian response to a major humanitarian crisis. And then also I want you to think about the embodied carbon and the impacts that a humanitarian response has the environment and a cradle-to-grave approach. So everything from staff recruitment, procurement, shipping, flights, storage, warehouses, labour, all the people that are involved in the end products to the exit strategy. Keep that in mind and its impact on both the finances and the climate and environment. So if we look at a typical WASH intervention, a water sanitation and hygiene response, it usually involves implementing a shallow well or a borehole, a number of latrines, ideally household level latrines, some hygiene training, and maintenance person trained with, usually from the local community, trained to maintain the well. I first saw this response in 2005 in South Sudan, and it's still pretty much the same response that we use today in rural communities. So as it's gone on for so long, you'd think it'd be a pretty good system and a pretty effective response. Well, in actual fact, it's not. It was failing, and I reported that it was failing in South Sudan in 2005, and it continues to fail today. In these climates with hot, dry seasons and heavy rainy seasons, the wells quickly break down, and without a payment mechanism in place and no supply chain, there's no way it can be maintained and functional. As well as that, the latrines are not used for a whole host of reasons, for different belief systems, for different cultural beliefs. They're not used, and they just stand there littering the landscape. Now, if you go back to thinking about what I mentioned earlier on the previous slide around these huge financial costs involved in a wash intervention, and add on the huge impact on the climate, especially considering the cradle to grave approach. And it could have been argued that it was all worth it because we've stopped open defecation, we've reduced groundwater contamination, we've improved safety and dignity and reduced diarrhea and dysentery. But we haven't done any of that. We've completely failed and just managed to litter the African landscape with unused latrines and dysfunctional shallow wells. And today there's around 50,000 dysfunctional shallow wells littering the landscape across Africa. Moving forward, business as usual is not an option. We need climate-informed and climate-resilient humanitarian aid. We know that local communities are always the first responders in a disaster event. We know that they also have generational knowledge and experience of dealing with crises and disasters, and they're already adapting to climate change. They might not speak the words and the concepts like we do, but it's their lives and livelihoods, and they're already adapting on the ground. We need to learn from them and how they are adapting, and then use that as the starting point for our work and to effectively engage with these communities. And I'm not romanticising the notion of collaborating with local communities. I know firsthand it's extremely challenging work. Communities come with their own politics, hierarchies, class and caste systems, religions, cultural nuances and beliefs. But it's through working harder to understand those that we can build trust and develop positive collaborations. And now I'm going to share some examples of where I've seen this done and with some positive impacts on the climate and the environment. In 2007, I was doing another evaluation in Somalia. Somalia was devastated by the 2004 Asian tsunami. It destroyed homes and fishing boats and destroyed and contaminated water sources. As well as that, these communities are largely living in poverty. There's regular clashes between clans. You're in the middle of pirate territory. So these communities are living in crisis and facing huge challenges. Something else to be mindful of is that in Somalia, everyone holds the same religion, and that's Islam. And that point will actually become important for our next slide. Norwegian Shared Shade was one of the humanitarian agencies responding, and they were responding in the wash sector. And in this particular town, they had implemented a borehole, a handful of community latrines because they had their own case of fraud, so they couldn't build household latrines, some hygiene and sanitation training, and a maintenance man. So very similar to the one that we'd seen in Liberia. And so they'd given them 3 months of fuel for the latrines. And I should add as well that latrines are not typically used in Somalia. This was a community that just practices open defecation and do not use latrines. So I'll be honest, I was a bit skeptical, thinking as to what I was going to actually find on the ground when I got there. And 1 year later, I was completely surprised. The borehole was fully functional with a payment mechanism in place that secured safe access for water for all. There was 100 household-built latrines that had used local resources to build their latrines, and 100 households had access to safe water via taps into the house. And if you can imagine a devastated community living in poverty in this area of Somalia and Puntland, it just wouldn't have seemed possible. So how did they do it? Well, it was by 2 pieces of innovation. Firstly, the original NCA team was led by an exiled Eritrean, a Kenyan engineer, and a handful of local staff. And before they rushed in and did anything, they gathered the elders and the religious leaders from throughout the communities and brought them together to look at the Quran and how water, cleanliness and sanitation were referred to in the Quran. And as I mentioned earlier, that everybody abides by the same religion. And in Somalia, the priorities of any community and any family is to be a better Muslim. And they pulled out over 40 different references to the use of water and cleanliness in the Quran. And they then used those to develop a training program for the communities. And what happened was behavioural change that normally takes generations was instantaneous, because most people in Somalia don't read, so they rely on the teachings from elders, from religious leaders and other community members to teach them how they can improve and be a better Muslim. And the moment they were informed that open defecation is bad for their religion, and having a household level latrine that's well maintained and cleaned was a better way forward, People began drawing on local resources to develop their own latrines at the household level. Second, that was critical to this was the innovation of the elders and the chief of this town at the time. After a few months, they went back to NCA and said, this borehole is not working. It's not going to be sustainable. Can we privatise it? NCA said, this is your borehole. You do what if you think. And so they did. They privatised it and put a payment mechanism in place and ensured that mosques, schools, and anybody classed as vulnerable got free water. Like with most of the crisis affected communities that I get the opportunity to work with and collaborate with, I try and stay in touch with them long term. I'm still in touch with Benda Bela, the town, through colleagues in NCA that are still there. And in 2019, we were able to get the latest figures from the town, and they were to establish that they had over 1,600 household latrines, which is over half the population having their own household latrines. Obviously, this population has grown since it was since 2007. 1,100 households have got taps supplying clean water. We lost contact with them a little bit during the COVID years, but since we have been able to establish contact again and things are still working well. And again, not to romanticize this, the elders are very honest with us. They've had many challenges over the years. They've had their own cases of theft, their own breakdowns. They also have negative impacts because of their success. They have other displaced people coming to join their community. But as the elders tell me, they'll just keep on working harder to solve the problems as and when they arise. Here's an example from Satari refugee camp in Jordan. The picture on the left-hand side is Jason, a Syrian refugee living in Satari now. He's quite famous for his work, so you may have seen him or heard of his work. In Syria, before the conflict, he ran a recycling centre. So when he got to Satari refugee camp and seen the amount of waste and litter around, he began organising people to collect and sort the waste. He then started selling the waste to other people. He hand-built himself his own compactor, and then with funds from other organisations and agencies, he was given another compactor. He now employs between 100 to 200 people. He's turning a profit, selling waste to China, India, Jordan, and some other companies as well. An example of innovation on the ground in a refugee camp by a refugee that's also having a positive impact on the environment. I collaborate with a group of Palestinian farmers and Israeli engineers and Palestinian engineers. And in this region, it's warming at twice the rate of the global average, and it's not prepared for heat waves, wildfires, and droughts. Typically, Palestinian farmers will engage in date farming, which is the middle picture. The problem with date farming is that they consume huge amounts of water. So it's not sustainable going forward. So we're looking for alternative crops to farm. As well as that, this is a dry, arid region. But the Israelis and Palestinian engineers developed a low-cost, low-tech, off-grid grey wastewater recycling system, which is the first photograph on the left you can see, which is now functioning and in place for about 20 farmers. And one of the crops they're looking at is grape farming, which they are doing now. This is a really incredible engineering design, and it's being implemented actively in an extremely tense area with hot conflict all around. Some other examples that I'm aware of that are going on right now in the field in different countries, say drought-resistant crops being used by different communities, increases in the consumption of wild plants, reducing consumption of meats, livelihood diversification, and increasing the use of social media. I'm in touch with farmers in Sudan and South Sudan that are taking to TikTok and Instagram to learn climate-smart agricultural techniques and water conservation techniques. In parts of Thailand, I'm in touch with communities that are starting to have frog farming for subsistence use because frogs can survive in the increased water levels. We're seeing traditional floating vegetable gardens in Bangladesh, such as the photograph in the bottom left. Duck farming is also being explored in Bangladesh because ducks can swim, unlike chickens. And then there's my friend Shatha at the top left, doing a hydroponic farming in Palestinian refugee camps, where she lives in Ida refugee camps. Innovation is going on everywhere, and we need to start learning and collaborating with these communities to see how we can better support them and work with them going forward. Disrupting the status quo is something that I've always been good at, finding the cracks in the system, finding the way to do things differently so that it actually works on the ground. We know that business as usual is not an option. A humanitarian response has to be community-led, culture and context-led, climate-informed and climate resilient. So now I'm asking you, when you go back home, can you help disrupt the status quo? Can we not do things the way we normally do them? Can we help disrupt, change and evolve for good? Thank you. Thank you for watching, and if you've got any questions, please do get in touch.